Stay hungry, stay foolish.
So now on the Innovation Show, it's a great honour to welcome author of 4 fantastic books, including the great creative architect, Pierluigi Serraino. Did I say it right, man?
Yeah, you did great. You did great. I'm very happy to be with you guys.
It's great to talk to you, man. And we were rolling beforehand, and I had to get us recording because I was like, we're going to lose some magic. This is going to be like when James Brown was rolling on and didn't record some of those great takes beforehand.
Yes, I'm very delighted to be here, and I was telling Aidan I'm very fond of Irish people and Irish culture. Maybe it's my Italian heritage that makes me feel like this, but yeah. I have very close friends like that.
So we're going to talk about, you know, your ethos, but also some of the great work you've captured and brought to the world that was hidden in a way that was buried, and you brought this great gift back to the world of what is creativity. But before we go there, because you have a great backstory, Pierluigi, and you talked about that Italian heritage, but that's not really where. Yes, you were raised in Italy till you were 16, but you got off Italy and you landed in the States, and it's given you these great lenses to see the world totally different. It'd be great to hear your story.
Well, I was born and raised in Sicily, and I come from a family of builders. My father was a structural engineer, and my brother is also a structural engineer. I was raised on construction sites, and my mother was always very interested in the arts. So I'm the product of, in a classic sense, of both my parents. And my father was always a very entrepreneurial, and raised me to think independently and to follow my own instincts. And so I wanted to be a musician, and my father was very skeptical about the possibility of making a living out of this. So he made me aware that there was this thing called architecture, and he gave me a book called Architecture of Space by Bruno Zevi. And from there, I developed a very strong interest in architecture as an art form. At 16, I came to the United States. I was actually here for a month, and I came here by myself. Well, I was with my brother, who was 18 at the time, but he was very independent himself, and then we actually split when we were here. We landed in San Francisco. So I was on my own at 16 in the Bay Area, which was extraordinary in the early 80s. And I always felt that California was a place of free thinking. It's a frontier, and it's an economic frontier, it's a technological frontier, but it's a sociological frontier, and intellectually as well. So I then came back to Europe, came to the US multiple times, went to Rome to study architecture, and graduated, a license there, and then catapulted myself to Los Angeles to do a master. Actually, did 2 masters, one at SciArc and one at UCLA. And there I did a lot of work, theoretical work on architectural photography. I met Julius Schulman, the great architectural photographer. I did a book called Modernism Rediscovered, that came out with Taschen in 2000. I'm saying this because it felt that California was completely open to anything. I mean, it was a total newcomer, and all I had to do was making phone calls and nag people, and it was far away from everything. I didn't know anybody. I just had to follow my instincts, and people were responsive to that. And so with this, I met a number of characters. I met the folks of Morphosis, many different architects, Frank Isra, Mark Mack. I even met Frank Gehry in the early days. It was quite a wonderful a playground. And then I moved to UC Berkeley, where I worked on my doctoral program in architecture. And I kept writing and I kept practicing. I've always done this at the same time, because I think of architecture as a humanistic enterprise. It's not really about square footage. It's about transforming the program into something impactful on the human condition. And in this respect, to me, the architect that I respond the most to is Louis Kahn, who sublimated the world of square footage into a spiritual experience. And his writing bear witness to this vision. So as I was working on this architecture photography and then California modernism, because Schulman photographed much of what was going on in the post-war period on the West Coast, I became aware of this extensive legacy, which is really the post-war period in the US and especially in California, which is where California became the center of worldwide attention. After World War II, this amazing technology that had been developed, you have to think 50% of the federal budget came to California during World War II. The development of the aircraft industry and the shipbuilding industry in San Francisco and Los Angeles created an extraordinary technological society. The war is over. People are out there. They need a job. What are we going to do? Many of them go into the building industry. And this changes dramatically the way people do architecture and practice engineering and things like that. One of the characters that was most influential in my thinking in Berkeley here was Don Olson, who was one of the architects that selected the architects that would be part of the creativity study. And he was the one who made me aware that there were these files, that there was this material somewhere. And another person that told me about this was Raymond Neutra, the third son of Richard Neutra, whom I met casually at the Oakland airport. He said, I found the files on my father. This was 2009. I think you should look at them, because Richard Neutra was one of the 40 architects that was studied. Now, this study is very important because it's one of a kind enterprise. One of those efforts that is unrepeatable in of itself. Essentially, you identify the most creative people in one field. Obviously, they're all alive. You invite them to come to Berkeley in groups of 10 for 3 days, and they actually decide to come. The folks that came to be part of the study in 58, 59 were really quite extraordinary characters. There was Eero Saarinen, there was Louis Kahn, there was Richard Neutra, there was I.M. Pei, Pietro Belluschi, Elliot Noyes, Philip Johnson, George Nelson, John Johansson. I mean, we can go on and on and on. It was really remarkable. It's remarkable because Saarinen had already done General Motors by 1955, and Philip Johnson had done the Seagram with under Mies in 1958. So these were people that were paid top dollars, and to come to Berkeley for 3 days to submit themselves to an experiment that was kind of far-fetched. It was done under the pressure of, in this case, William Worcester, who was a big supporter of Eero Saarinen. He was the dean at UC Berkeley, the College of Environmental Design. And Saarinen was the most important architect of his generation. So when people realized that Saarinen was coming, everybody jumped on it, and they wanted to be part of the study. So it kind of snowballed. And so you have this cast of characters in here that goes through this very unlikely experiment, a study that was structured around the assessment method, which was a method used to select individuals that would operate effectively under tremendous pressure during war missions, counter-espionage, and things of this nature. And so they translated this method from war aims to civic aims, essentially, instead of looking at the effective people, they were looking at creative people, but the concept was the same. So 3 days in a lab, going through group discussions, live interviews, multiple graphic forms, checklists. There were a total of 22 hours of procedures that were administered in those 3 days. And there were the formal times where people were being studied, and then there were the informal times. It's one thing when you're sitting down and you are checking these forms, doing whatever you have to do, and then when they just interact with each other, their word choice, their physical arrangement, everything became a subject of study. And so this extreme form of surveillance was something that had never been fully done to this scale, because you have to think that the architect study is only one of the many studies that they did. They studied writers, they studied Air Force pilots, they studied the expedition, the members of the expedition on Mount Everest. They studied, as I was telling you, Irish managers. They studied engineers of Silicon Valley. They studied women mathematicians, and a bunch of other groups. So it's this was a gargantuan effort by all standards, and something that was never repeated again. And the fact that after all this effort and all this money spent and this tremendous human resources in play, that they did not do a book on it, it seemed to be absolutely absurd. I mean, it's like you're imploding in so much data that you don't even know how to get around it.
Yeah.
And that is what happened, really. So in a way, I wrote the book for them, but adding all the backstage details on how the selection process took place, who were the people that they were dealing with, what was the rationale behind many of their criteria, and that's just as important as the results. So there's a lot to reflect upon. Although the book this point came out June of last year, I keep discovering things. I mean, the archive is inexhaustible. So there are many papers that have been unpublished by some of the IPAR founders with additional data, new insights. They all reinforce the idea that the creative is really an independent thinker, and it's someone that sees the world in a very different way. He sees the reality, but the way he or she sees the reality is not patterned the way it is seen by the majority of the population. I mean, if you think in terms of the bell curve, the creative works at the edges of that curve, and so figure out that the really knowledge is the reorganization of bits of creativity is the organization of bits of knowledge that are linked in unconventional ways. And that's an important part, to see that a particular situation, a particular object, a particular relationship can be sequenced in ways that are not typical, will yield a result that is unforeseen. The creative, by default, does not suppress the possibility of an alternative, but let it all play out, and that's huge.
Yeah, it's actually something I wanted to talk to you about. When I read about your work, I felt there's such a lesson here from an innovation perspective, in that so many architects are actually innovators. They see the world differently, and so many entrepreneurs actually see the world differently, whether it be through some type of diversity. We mentioned before that some of the best architects were dyslexic and could write backwards, etc., and just actually saw things differently and saw patterns where others did not see. Something you say often is that it often looks like a step backwards what the architect is doing, but eventually people see that it's the way forwards.
So the challenge of architecture is that it takes a significant amount of advocacy for a building to be built. So you have to rally a community to be behind you, and that's the reason why the most influential architects are amazing, persuasive people, because they have to sell you a promise of happiness, of things that have yet to happen. And if you're doing this not as a commercial enterprise, but as a narrative of possibilities that are just simply not the usual competent deliverable, then you have to make a case for why that will work. And then it's a leap of faith. In fact, one of the key ingredients of the creative is the courage. And at the end of the book, there is like the pinnacle of the discovery that McKinnon and his team found. It's just, you just have the courage, because you can be intelligent, you can have talent, you can have insight, but are you going to act on that insight? You can have the energy, you can have the motivation, but will you do it? Will you actually take the leap? And you might crash, but crashing doesn't diminish the effort of trying. Because in the absence of trying, you will never, ever move the world forward. It's impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about the Wright Brothers.
Yeah.
Right?
It's exactly in line with innovation. And I never thought about it until I read your work, because it dawned on me that all this stuff, all this creativity, and all the traits that the study discovered and you uncovered are the same as the innovator, in that they have the courage, they have self-confidence, they believe in it, they see the world differently. They also have to sell that idea to other people who are non-believers and get them on side. And they're all similar traits. And I just thought that was just such a great thing to see, that people who innovate and create different environments are also people who are innovators, and that architects are actually the best architects in the world are innovators.
The architecture is dealing with the mechanisms of real estate, and real estate means finances, and means banking, and means loans, and banks are notoriously risk adverse. So how can you promote innovation and fuel this leap forward into the unknown when you don't know where you're going to land? You have a hunch that is going to go in that direction. You believe, you have this fierce belief, but your belief, it's informed intuition. It's not irrational. You're not being capricious or out of your mind. You have a hunch that something is not quite right, and that there is a solution out there. So the creative consistently ruffles the feather of the norm. The people that live their life according to the norm will behave accordingly, but won't have the actual chance of moving the field forward. Now, not everybody has to be an innovator, obviously, and it's perfectly fine to be competent and to do excellent work along those lines. But if you're seeking the next big thing, it's just not going to come from that, because the creativity it's rooted in skepticism and in doubt. Is this really the only way in which we can do one thing? And that's why, yes, we have shoes, but then there's always someone that comes up with a different shoe that tells us a different story about walking. And it's just not about protecting our souls. It's about the experience of inhabiting your foot. I mean, that your foot inhabits a piece of equipment in a way that has never been seen before. Everything in creativity of every kind, it's about charting a new territory, and the new territory is inherently fraught with risk. So how do you forge an agenda of risk-taking in an environment that is so commercially fettered, by specific ties and obligations? It's a real challenge, and therefore the architect that is able to pull it off, and the creative in general, has to sustain that vision for a very long time, because the system will consistently bash you until it has obliterated you, unless you have enough resilience to counteract it and obviously have some demonstration that your thinking is actually grounded into something, because the creativity has to attend a real problem, not an imaginary problem. There have to be specific traits that McKinnon had identified very clearly. That's the beauty of the IPAR study. And the conclusion is that they did not hesitate in making conclusive statements about particular conditions. I mean, what are the conditions of creativity? Is the creative person? Is the creative environment? Is the creative product? Is the creative process? In the absence of these four elements entering in synergy with each other, you cannot have creativity. I'm sure there are creative people in parts of the world that are inherently not structured for that creativity to emerge in its full potential. Because creativity is, the creative person is in every culture, in every age, in every class system. It's not tied to the particularities of nature of a social system. It just is out there. It's just a different way of thinking, and that everybody can do that.
Yeah.
Anybody, as long as you're willing to listen to yourself. And that's why this resonates very much with Maslow and with the Winnicott, the psychologists, that we all were creative until schooling kicked in. It gives you the instruments of literacy, but at the same time starts editing your thought process so that you start thinking more and more alike, so that you can become a functioning part of society. But the creative holds on to aspects of that childhood. So your curiosity is inexhaustible.
Yeah.
You're never done with your work, ever. It energizes you. It's very life affirming.
That's where that independence and that ego, that self-confidence and that courage that you mentioned is so important, because you're going against the grain. And it'd be great, Pierluigi, if we could talk about some of the traits, because I find this uncovered a whole new way of thinking for me. From this study, I saw this is what employers are looking for today, because companies are becoming very similar and companies are being disrupted over and over again. Yet companies hire the same people from the same schools and the same consultants to come in and do the same strategies for the companies. And it's just the Einstein insanity loop over and over. And what they need is different thinkers. Reading your book will show them some of the traits and some of the characteristics that they need for people, new hires into their company, to give fresh thinking.
There is a challenge that is a default into the company and the creative. Companies are business entities. They come together under the pressure of commerce and money making, and the creative has the economic value as the lowest value compared to the aesthetic value. When I talk about aesthetic, it's not about simply the sheer aesthetic as a superficial layer to be added. The creative person doesn't want to solve the problem alone. He or she wants to solve the problem beautifully as an art form. It has to be right. It's just like writing the perfect algorithm. And maybe many algorithms can do the same, can serve the same function. That's why this false belief that the post-war period is a problem-solving period is actually debunked, this myth, because the creative doesn't really care about solving the problem. Yes, the gathering data, doing the classic data retrieval, figuring out what's happening, what's at stake, who are the stakeholders, and blah, blah, blah. That's an aspect of it, but that is not where the creative effort comes. It's sublimating the specificity of the situation into a bigger statement, which is a statement about the beauty of the question that you're dealing with, and the resolution of it as at the level of the art form. And that has nothing to do with the architect. Even the mathematicians were interested at that level. The aspect that was really fascinating about the study is that the same traits were found in people who had a lot of relationship with the media, like the architects, because the press is a very important aspect of architecture. There's a lot in name recognition, which mobilizes money, not differently from fashion. But the mathematicians don't have a presence in the media. People just don't know who they are, right? Name me a mathematician today that is the most famous one. Nobody knows. And yet they had the same trait. They did not want to work in groups. They wanted to explore their inner world. The work is designed to address a specific problem, a real problem, not an imaginary one. There's nothing capricious about it. It's solved in a way that has never been solved before. So therefore, there is a skepticism around that kind of response. And then as you keep doing more and more work in that vein, then the community realizes that maybe there is a different way of doing things. So there's an element that there's a time factor in the creativity. It's not that you have a sudden burst of something and then voila, you have the solution. They have also identified the 5 phases of creativity, which were in a way, they confirmed through their empirical study what had already been hypothesized. You have a data retrieval period, then you do a processing of it. You're trying to figure out an answer. Routinely, you get frustrated. It's not good enough. Yes, you can be competent, but it's not where it should be. You retreat yourself from that question. Subliminally, your brain still processes the question. You have a eureka moment, and you go back and verify that through very disciplined work. These 5 phases exist pretty much in every field. And so that's something that if you can declare it, then you can structure a company culture that will enable these phases to exist, right? So that's important. If the creative doesn't work on a 9-to-5 scheme, what kind of scheme can you create where your timesheet is organized in a different way? Yeah. Maybe it's an accounting issue, right? Because you need to have a job number for your time to be. Because ultimately, people they need to have the retirement thing. They need to have the standard perks of employment. But the creative doesn't really care for that. I mean, I have to say, it's not. The creative doesn't tend to be company material in the way we know companies today. So maybe it's a question of finding a new format for a company for these synergies to take place, because ultimately, these are not people that work entirely in isolation. They come out, they generate the idea in isolation, but often and their execution takes place in teams. But if the creative is put in a team right away from the get-go, he or she will typically underperform. He will do the least amount of work because he or she will feel typically that the work is below the standard that he or she has decided to have. And it sounds very arrogant, but not everybody, if you have worked in groups, not everybody has the same interest and the same drive. The creative is radicalized, we're self-radicalized into the field of their choice. Right? It's not there. There is no holiday. There is no Christmas. Yeah. I remember I met the Eero Saarinen's son, Eric Saarinen, last year, and he was telling me that at some point Kevin Roach told him about the story that his father came in one day and he said, "Where is everybody?" And Kevin Roach said, "Well, it's Christmas." What do you mean it's Christmas? Kevin is Irish, so you guys should relate to this. But yeah. It's funny. I mean, the guy is in his own time zone. Yeah. It's just, what do you mean it's Christmas?
I love that.
So, but
yeah. You know what, Pierluigi? I was just thinking there when you said this about the creative person not feeling, committed to the group or feeling that this work is substandard and they go quiet. And you often see this with really talented people, but you also see it in places like the classroom where a child might go quiet, and then they're seen as enfant terrible, or they're seen as the
Yeah.
awkward child, and they're almost conditioned to think there's something wrong with them, and it's only through
Yeah.
mentorship or strong parents to ignite that gift or to unleash it, that child can succeed. How do you feel about that? Because I know you're a father.
That's something that I as a parent, I've been myself interested in. In the study that McKinnon conducted, he realized that the parents of these creatives gave a significant amount of autonomy to their children. So their children knew. They felt that their children knew how to conduct themselves, but they also held them to very high standards. The standards were through their own conduct and their own kind of sense of authority. Someone that was a parent could be could set an example of ethics, of work ethic, of integrity, something that is transferred to the child, but then the child is not controlled, is not micromanaged. The child is allowed to develop on his or her own pace. And then in the life of the creative, there's always someone that awakens them to their own potential. Sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a brother or sister, sometimes is occasionally is a parent, but often is a teacher. Someone that made them accountable to their possibility, to the possibility, potential, to what they could really do, and then that energy is unleashed. It's as if the creative is an incubation, kind of a sort of a moving target. He or she moves around and tries to. He's interested in everything. There's curiosity on every subject, and at some point, that curiosity finds a specific outlet, and then tremendous intensity goes into that. Tremendous resolve, and it's that one individual, a friend, a mentor, someone who has some age difference, that in a way establishes a benchmark of performance and delivery, to which the creative wants to match and exceed. That was pretty much across the board.
I love that, and you know what? It reminds me of. It's almost like our role, and if we are privileged enough to have the bandwidth and also maybe the finances to do this, that I often feel it's our role as parents. It's almost like the child is a honeybee, and you're to give them as many flowers to test, and to find the one that they want. And then when you see and you're aware, you have your radar on to go, he or she is really into this. Now I need to nourish that and nurture it and let them intensify.
But why can this model be applied to companies, right? I mean, if a company creates a situation where people can flourish, but really can flourish, not that they get milked to extract labor from them in a classic Marxist scheme, and then they are getting peanuts, because the underperformance is the function of a lack of respect for the workforce. Yeah, okay, I'm going to give you my time, but what do I get in return? I myself, when I worked in firms, I was never credited for anything.
Yeah,
and, no matter how hard I worked,
yeah,
it mattered. Well, I mean but it matters to me.
It does, yeah.
Right, and it's. And then even the financial rewards goes somewhere else. I don't know, there has to be a different way of doing things, because I frankly see widespread unhappiness in the workforce. I don't see growth in a professional growth. I don't see the betterment of the human condition. I just see people receiving paychecks but being disillusioned.
Yeah,
and then you buy stuff.
Yeah, and
it just doesn't seem very.
Yeah, and it's getting
Yeah, and
worse,
it's
isn't it?
worse and worse,
It's getting worse,
frankly.
and it's actually, I joined the company I'm in, Catawave, at the moment. I joined it for that reason, because I was seeing the same thing, and I was like, there's people disillusioned. There's companies that are rudderless, that are just ghost ships on the ocean and are heading towards icebergs. And a lot of CEOs and leaders are just caretakers of a role rather than actually wanting to do that and to change. And then they have people like you, or change makers or mavericks within the company, who are capable of changing the course of the ship, yet they won't engage with them and let them have a more of a leadership role, or let them have more of influence on the company.
Oh, but the system will purge you. The system is designed to keep the status quo. I mean, I am all from entrepreneurship and individualism. I do feel that nurturing other people's talent. It does benefit the company because it's an ecosystem. People can always return to the company, or they can form their own company, right? I mean, it's an aspect of I don't know, raising new talent and knowledge transfer. I mean, we're not here. We all have an expiration date, and this kind of thinking is the thinking of the alchemist. If you have some beautiful knowledge that you can share and you can pass around, why not? And then you will develop more, because you have created conditions of growth, of artistic growth, of creative growth. People that hang on to particular things as the only thing are actually hiding more structural issues. It's very one-sided. I admit that. I just don't see a real healthy environment in the absence of a possibility for an individual to grow, not just financially when you have the opportunity to grow financially, but to grow as a human being.
Yeah.
I mean, learning is a structural part of the human condition. You want to learn, you want to be aware. If you spend so much time working, it cannot be drudgery. Monday should be a day to celebrate, not like a death sentence.
I see the most creative people, they don't do work-life balance because they don't see a division between work and life. It's the same thing, and they're doing what they work at as part of their life. And that's why I think that what you said is so spot on about it needs to be a journey of discovery and curiosity and learning for it to be anyway enjoyable. But I'd love to jump to this, Pierluigi, because
Sure.
you said this at the start about when you got to San Fran and California, that you felt that it was such a place of creativity and growth. And I'm a huge believer in that. And you as an architect will totally get this, is that if the environment, be it a building or an area, is filled with like-minded people, and this goes for corporations and organizations as well. If people are on the same page mentally, they can achieve such amazing things. And then if the environment enables them and gives them even more, and you talked about a building being so much more than a building, that it gets into it's a spiritual entity, essentially, that those things put together can really create magic in a business.
I am completely with you. I'm completely with you as far as both the human ecology that is part of a company, as well as the physical environment to which you're part of. There is some kind of cross-pollination between the place you're physically inhabiting and the way you experience life. I don't have any empirical studies on that, but I have noticed that in spaces that have been well designed, and they don't have to be modern spaces. They can be also the spaces of classicism, that people live better. Their mental health is much higher, and they tend to live longer. I mean, the quality of your life is significantly higher. So a sense of feeling connected and part of a bigger thing is something that definitely helps promote a desire to contribute and to give, because the creative ultimately is a romantic. If economic value is not the primary reason why people do what they do, the excitement of sharing that discovery is as if, you know what, I just realized this thing. Look at this, and then wow, everybody looks at the same thing and they get the same excitement. The creative works more along those lines, and he or she will continue to operate along those lines with all their work. California created conditions in certain parts. I would say it still does today, although the digital economy is creating its own form of feudalism, unfortunately. But when you are away from the lid of social systems that have been historically locked, you don't allow the alternative to grow organically. So California was always far away from the centers of power until it became itself its own center of power. You have to think that the internet was a military technology, and the MIT, got a tremendous amount of federal funding for that, but it's still part of the East Coast, and the East Coast is closer to Europe, and Europe has its own hierarchical structure that doesn't allow ideas that could upset the society as we know it to do what it wants to do. So in California, none of this was at play. So the internet exploded through Silicon Valley and through essentially a technology that has put the world on its knees. I mean, no one can do anything without computers. I mean, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Impossible. And they're all in Silicon Valley because there are conditions that allow, it's an intersection of things, right? It's the role of California in the world order. It's the end of the Western world. The climate is fantastic. The place is only 165 years old, practically yesterday for European standards. Everybody's always a newcomer, but because he or she's a newcomer, is already instantly a Californian. It's very easy. It's very easy to fit in because no one. There is no norm about the Californian. It's an open-ended scheme of human achievement. And if you just want to stay in the next to the pool, it's just fine. It's just that laziness and pleasure is built into this. But at its core, there is this individualism filled with youthful energy. And youthful energy, youth is something, is not chronological. It's in the spirit of the people. And Frank Lloyd Wright said something really beautiful in interviews with Mike Wallace toward the end of his life. He said, young is something that there's nothing you can do, nothing at all about. But the youthful is something that it's part of your spirit. And if you are youthful, that quality, you will never lose it. You will always have it. And California has that spirit. I mean, Frank Gehry's 88, but it's very youthful as an individual. I mean, the architecture is very joyful. It has a lot of, you might not like it, people say that's not architecture, whatever, but that's a different story. It's the very possibility of doing it. Where can this happen? And that's what California has been, and that's why creativity. Talking about the four categories: creative product, the creative process, creative person, creative environment, came in full force here at a scale that has yet to be matched. I mean, I love New York, but New York is not California. It's just not. New York is the center of economy, it's the center of publishing, but it's not the center of technology. It's another London.
Yeah,
it's a financial but it's extremely difficult to break through New York because it's very locked through family. It's a much older society. That's why I don't believe in China as an economic. Yeah, I mean, yes, there's a sheer number of people, but there's no free speech. The environment is not the one that we have here in California. And, I'm not saying that California is perfect. I mean, a lot of things are that can go haywire, but broadly speaking, the conditions are more favorable here for things to happen on many levels.
Yeah, but it makes a lot of sense because it's like even in an organization, you might walk into one section of the business and it will have a totally different culture and a different value system and a different mindset, and that you feel almost a different energy. And it's the same with even in the same country, you get those different values and different mindsets and different energy feels, and that's what it's like in the States. I find you go from state to state, or you go from Cali to New York, and you feel that it's a different vibe, literally.
Yeah. No, you're right. You feel it, and therefore your ability to operate and the way you think about how you could operate changes, because certain options are completely foreclosed. And the thing is, in California, no one is going to tell you you're a total nut job. You will always have someone who's going to listen to you. Whereas in other parts of the world, people start laughing. This is ridiculous. Why would you even think about that? You don't even start. So you cannot do anything until you start thinking about the possibility of making that thing happen. Nothing will change before having the vision of it. I know it sounds like I'm sounding like Captain Obvious, but it is true.
Yeah,
it's true. You have to think it. You have to declare it through a drawing, a diagram, or something, and then it becomes transmittable to someone else. And in California, there's always someone who's willing to listen to you. And it's not because people were born here. I mean, a fraction of the people has been born here. Everybody has come here from somewhere else. So everybody carries. I mean, I would say the general ethos is an ethos of discovery and playfulness and possibilities of making things happen. You just don't come here to lounge. Let's put it like that. I mean, yeah, you might go to Palm Springs, but you don't stay here to be inactive. Let's put it like this. Zuckerberg could have stayed in Harvard, but he would have not made Facebook. You have not created. There was no way.
Yeah,
he had to come. So,
Pierluigi, it's been phenomenal speaking to you, man. It's been a real pleasure. And the book is The Creative Architect. It's a very highly recommended read for way beyond architecture. I think that it's really important to say that to our audiences, that this book is, while it's the subject matter and you're the subject matter expert, there's so many values and nuggets of knowledge that you can get from this book. And Pierluigi Serraino, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for joining us.
Ada, it's been wonderful, and I greatly enjoy our time together.